how does the interplay between geopolitics of three theatres impact Australia?
So I think for a lot of its history, Australia has liked to believe that it can punch above its weight in world affairs and have an influence that is perhaps sort of bigger than Australia's relative weight in the world. Now, insofar as conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East is concerned, Australia only has minimal contribution to both. In the case of Ukraine, Australia has been able to provide some much needed military support to the Ukrainian effort in the face of Putin's illegal invasion and some financial support. But that has gradually diminished over time to the point where the Australian government is starting to be criticised quite a lot for not doing more to help Ukraine at its hour of peril. In the case of the Middle East, Australia can do very little there as a middle power to influence the outcome. But it has tied up the current Australian Labor government into knots because of the effect that it's had on domestic politics. There are a number of senior Labor politicians in Australia who are representing electorates in the country that have a very strong Muslim population and who do not like what they see sometimes as the government's instinctive support for the position of Israel. Now, in terms of Australia's main priority, it is of course the rise of China and the rapid military build-up. We hear politicians from both sides of politics now talking about the Chinese military transformation as being the biggest since the end of the Second World War. So what we see is Australia doing more and more in lockstep with its major US ally, but also with other partners in the region, especially Japan, to show China that these democracies are cooperating. Australia has signed a huge $368 billion deal with the United States and Britain to attempt to acquire a nuclear submarine capability. It is doing more and more military exercises and training with Japan. It's a part of the Quad relationship with Japan, India and the United States. And it's also, of course, doing its fair share in terms of the Asian latticework of alliances that Washington has set up.
How does Australia then navigate the geopolitics of three theatres?
I think what we're seeing is, so for example, whereas 20 years ago, Australia was involved in the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's been a very strong tradition in Australia of sending its soldiers abroad, particularly to the Middle East, and that dates from World War II, World War I, and even before that in the 1880s. Now I think though the Australian government is starting to say that its priority is on East Asia and the Pacific. It is looking to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific. It's looking to help with its allies to counter China's rise in East Asia. Now, it was very instructive, for example, that when the Houthis were very active and still are active in the Red Sea, Australia was unable to send a ship to help the international effort there. Australia did send some military service personnel, but the government was widely criticised for not sending some kind of real naval presence. That's because the Australian defence capability is really struggling. There is a big mismatch, I think, between the government's rhetoric about the threat that it perceives in Asia, in that geopolitical theatre. It says it's urgent, it says the strategic situation is deteriorating, and yet its ability to actually have any meaningful defence capability to make a significant impact in the, God forbid, event of some kind of military contingency, that gap is just getting wider. But Australia, instead, what it has really done is basically made itself into the launching pad for the United States' effort in countering China. Australia has given the United States a series of airfields in the north of the country. It already hosts a very significant US intelligence facility in the middle of the country at Pine Gap, and it is about to start construction on a US submarine base in the west of Australia. So increasingly Australia's contribution to the theatre is the fact that it's a continent that gives the United States access to these facilities, purchase on the Indian Ocean, and the capacity to project its power up through Southeast Asia into Northeast Asia.